of numbers on the African continent are Muslims. If you look at North Africa, if you look at West Africa, if you look at East Africa, if you look at North Central Africa, Sudan, Mali, so on and so forth, these are Muslims, predominantly Muslims. The most heavily populated country in Africa, Nigeria, has over 100 million people, 115 million people in Nigeria. 65, 70% Muslim. Muslim. Also the second largest supplier of oil to the United States, Nigeria. Nigeria. Right? Majority Muslim. The three most heavily populated countries in Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Tanzania. Nigeria majority Muslim, Tanzania majority Muslim, and as quiet as it is kept, Ethiopia is majority Muslim. But that's not talked about. Ethiopia is always associated with the Coptic Christians, but Ethiopia is majority Muslim. We remember back when on the first Hijrah, when the Muslims went to Ethiopia. You know that the king of Ethiopia at that time was Muslim. Was so-called Christian. And later on became Muslim. As a matter of fact, if you remember when the Prophet ﷺ sent out letters to all of these different kings, the only one who came to Islam was the king of Ethiopia. And Ethiopia was the only country in Africa that was never colonized. Was never colonized. The Prophet ﷺ had said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's protection would come, and blessings would come on him and his people. That's what he said to all the leaders. The king of Ethiopia became a Muslim. As a matter of fact, the Africans in the Christian Africans, the Christians in Africa, always had a tendency never to view Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, as God. The Christians in Africa, whether it was North Africa with Arius, or whether it was in Ethiopia, the Christians of Africa historically had never had a problem, in not believing that Jesus was God. That came from Europe. That came from Rome. Jesus being God. But Ethiopia is majority Muslim. So the three most populated countries in Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, majority Muslim. If you look at the African continent and you see where the major incursion was on the African continent of Europe. And when I say a major incursion, I mean when the Europeans came into Africa and set up shop. If you look and see what area that is and was, it's South Africa. It's no coincidence that in the area in which the European imperialist powers came and set up a settler type colony was in the area of Africa where there was the less Muslims. That's no coincidence. They didn't do that in West Africa. I mean set up like they did in South Africa. They didn't do that in West Africa. They didn't do it in East Africa. They didn't do it in North Africa. They did it in the place where there was the least Muslims. Because if we look at the history, we'll see that those who gave the strongest resistance to colonialism were the Muslims. So now, getting back to the academic oversight. Academic oversight is what one historian calls it. Alex Haley, in his book Roots, and we want to show you some clips from that, inshallah, later on. When Roots came out in the mid-70s, it was, it was just popular. But many of us didn't realize how much Islamic content was in Roots. And sometimes when you see and you hear about the Islamic content in Roots, more often than not, you'll hear brothers and sisters say, wait a minute, that was in Roots? They did a slick job of mixing the Muslims with pagan type customs. The Mandinka or Muslims. But if you check out Roots, you will see that these so-called Muslims was walking around in loincloths. You know what I'm saying? Women uncovered from the waist up. These were so-called Muslims. They gave them sort of like a so-called pagan type animist look, but they were supposed to be Muslims. And then on the ship, when they were talking to each other, one of the brothers was talking about how, we're warriors. We're Allah's warriors. You know, that type of thing, right? And Kunta Kinte is making dua on the ship. Right? Then, as they were getting ready to have the mutiny, they're on the ship and they're saying, there's no God but Allah. There's no God but Allah. There's no God. Y'all remember that? There's no God but Allah. There's no God but Allah. And then they went. One of the leaders of it was martyred. The next scene has Kunta Kinte making a dua on the ship. Oh Allah, please grant him paradise and let him see the face of our blessed Prophet Muhammad. Y'all remember that? You remember Kunta Kinte when he was in the shack, and he picks up the cricket and he starts talking to the cricket in his native tongue, and then they translate it, and he says, these people here, they have forgotten about Allah. Right? And then Kunta Kinte, of course, when he gives them the pork, they had him acting like an animal, grunting and things, like Spielberg did us in the Amistad. We look like animals, that type of thing, right? So they have him like sitting, that kind of thing, you know how they are. And when the pork was presented to him, he said, oh, you one of those guinea men. You one of those guinea men. Don't like that poke, huh? Right? A scene in which when Fiddler came into the room, Kunta Kinte is in sajda. He's in sajda. And then Fiddler tells him, don't let the master see you.